There are moments in the spiritual life when heaven seems silent, when death approaches, when darkness surrounds a soul, when nothing human can save what is slipping away. St. Faustina experienced such a moment, and what she witnessed would forever change the way the Church understands the mercy of God and the tenderness of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It began with a soul on the edge of eternity, trembling between despair and hope, unable to stand before divine justice, yet still desperately longing for light. Faustina was permitted to see what no human eye could see, the invisible battle for a dying soul. Angels waited, demons circled, and then, without warning, something happened that shook her to the core. A light cut through the darkness. Gentle but overwhelming, quiet but commanding. It was the Blessed Virgin Mary. She appeared not slowly, not gradually, but instantly, as though summoned by a force stronger than fear, stronger than death itself. Faustina stood frozen, unable to understand why Mary came so suddenly, until she heard the words that drew the Queen of Heaven into the room with irresistible speed. Words so powerful, so pure, that Mary did not hesitate even for a heartbeat. What were those words? The vision began in a place that felt suspended between earth and eternity, a place where St. Faustina often found herself whenever God allowed her to witness the mystery of a soul's final hour. She saw a small, dim room, barely lit by the flickering of a candle near the bedside. The air was thick, heavy with the fear and exhaustion of someone who had fought for too long. The dying soul lay motionless, but Faustina could sense the inner storm raging within. It was not only the physical agony of death, it was the terror of facing God unprepared. This soul, she understood immediately, carried wounds from a lifetime of spiritual neglect, wounds that left it too weak to stand before the blazing purity of divine justice. Around the bed, shadows twisted and moved. Faustina recognized them at once, spirits of darkness waiting with a cruel patience. They whispered accusations, replayed old sins, reminded the soul of every failure. Their strategy was simple: push the soul into despair at the final moment. Despair, after all, is the last doorway through which they attempt to drag a soul away from God forever. But this soul did not surrender completely. There was a trembling flicker inside, a spark of longing that refused to die, even in its brokenness. Faustina sensed the presence of angels as well, hovering like silent sentinels. They did not fight directly, but waited for something, some opening of grace that had not yet come. Their eyes, if angels could be said to have eyes, were fixed on the dying person with a tenderness beyond words. Faustina felt her own heart being pulled into the scene, as though she were standing beside the bed, breathing the same heavy air, carrying the same desperate hope. She knew heaven was waiting for a single moment, a single gesture, a single word that could shift the entire destiny of this soul. And then the atmosphere changed. A subtle vibration moved through the room, a sign that something beyond the veil was stirring. Faustina felt it before she saw it. The threshold between this world and the next was about to be crossed, not by the dying soul, but by someone far greater. What happened next was so sudden, so overwhelming in its beauty, that Faustina later struggled to put it into human words. The shift in the atmosphere grew stronger, like a breath of heaven sweeping through the room. The darkness recoiled. The whispers of the demons fell silent, not because they chose to be quiet, but because a presence had entered that no force of darkness could endure. A soft radiance began to form, not harsh, not blinding, but warm and alive, like the first light of dawn after a night that felt endlessly long. It gathered in one corner of the room, expanding gently until the shadows collapsed completely. And then she appeared. The Blessed Virgin did not descend slowly from the heavens. She did not approach as though traveling across distance. She was simply there, instantaneously, effortlessly, as if she had been waiting just beyond the veil, listening, attentive, ready to come the very moment her heart was called. Faustina felt an indescribable mixture of awe and peace wash over her. Mary's presence did not intimidate, yet it filled the space with a reverence so profound that even the angels bowed their heads. Mary stood near the dying soul, her mantle radiating a purity that seemed to calm the turbulent air. Her eyes were filled not with sorrow, but with maternal determination, the kind a mother carries when she is about to defend her child from danger. Faustina noticed that Mary did not glance at the demons. They had already fled, unable to tolerate her light. Nor did she look at the angels. They waited in silent expectation. Instead, Mary gazed directly at the dying soul, as though she had come for this one moment alone. The soul, which had been trembling between fear and hope, sensed her immediately. A soft cry, barely audible, escaped its spiritual depths. The atmosphere was charged with meaning, yet Faustina understood something crucial. Mary did not come merely because a soul was dying. She came because something had been said, something heaven could not ignore. Faustina stood motionless, her heart pounding, knowing she was on the verge of witnessing a mystery of mercy that few mortals would ever comprehend. What had summoned the Queen of Heaven with such breathtaking immediacy? Faustina's heart raced as she tried to grasp the meaning behind Mary's sudden and unmistakable arrival. Even in the presence of this heavenly radiance, she sensed that the Blessed Virgin's appearance followed a law far older and deeper than human understanding. A spiritual law woven into the very fabric of salvation history. Mary never moves without purpose. Every intervention of hers is precise, deliberate, and rooted in the mysterious bond she shares with her Son. And in that moment, Faustina understood that heaven responds to certain truths with a speed that defies earthly time. There is a hidden order in the spiritual world, a harmony that the saints perceive only when God lifts the veil. It is the law of mercy, a divine rhythm in which God's justice, Mary's maternal heart, and the cry of a soul meet. This law does not erase justice, it completes it. It does not bypass holiness, it fulfills it. Yet few souls know how to touch this law, how to awaken the response that Mary's heart longs to give. Faustina realized that the dying soul had done something rare. It had reached into that deep current of heavenly truth and pulled upon a thread that Mary cannot resist, the acknowledgement of her unique role in the mystery of redemption. Faustina also knew that Mary's presence was no accident. The saints often wrote that Mary comes swiftly when a soul calls upon her with trust, but this was different. This was immediate. This was instant. This was the kind of response that happens only when heaven hears a specific echo, one that resonates perfectly with the mission God entrusted to Mary at the foot of the cross. It was an echo of love, of humility, of surrender. But above all, it was the echo of a truth that honors her in the exact way God desires her to be honored. Still, the full picture had not yet been revealed. Faustina felt it in her soul. The dying person had spoken words aligned with this unseen law, words that matched the will of God so precisely that Mary could not delay her coming, words that would have moved her even if whispered in total silence. She had heard these words before in prayer, in the soft groanings of penitence, in the pleas of those who knew their need for mercy, but never, not once, had she seen them bring Mary in such a burst of maternal urgency. Something extraordinary was unfolding. The soul had touched the very heart of heaven, and Faustina was about to discover how. The dying soul lay between two worlds, and Faustina felt the weight of every second passing. The air around the bed pulsed with a tension that was not merely human fear, but the trembling of a spirit standing at the threshold of eternity. She watched as the soul struggled within itself, burdened by memories, pierced by regret, reaching blindly for something it could not yet name. The demons had vanished at Mary's presence, yet the soul remained in a state of profound inner conflict. It was as though it sensed that a single movement of the heart could determine its eternal destiny. Then, with a heaviness that seemed to come from the very depths of its history, the soul uttered a small sound, half prayer, half cry. Faustina leaned closer, her spirit attentive, knowing that every word spoken in these moments carries indescribable weight. And the soul spoke, not with eloquence, not with confidence, but with the raw honesty of someone who finally sees their life with unfiltered clarity. It murmured a confession of its unworthiness, an acknowledgement of the many years spent ignoring God's grace. The tone was filled with sorrow, not self-pity, a realization of how much love had been wasted, how many chances had been rejected. Yet Faustina sensed something important. This was not the utterance that summoned Mary. These words were sincere, yes, painful, yes, necessary, yes. They stripped the soul bare, leaving nothing to hide behind, but they lacked the key, the spark, the invocation that had drawn the Mother of God into the room with such urgency. This was the soul's preparation, the breaking of the ground, the moment of humility that opens a space for grace to enter. Faustina felt compassion rise within her. She knew the soul's sorrow was real, but sorrow alone does not compel heaven into action. There had to be more, something the soul had spoken before, or something it would speak after. The Blessed Virgin stood still, listening, waiting not for apologies or lamentations, but for something far deeper. Faustina sensed that Mary, though radiant and calm, was holding her breath in a divine way, waiting for the words that touched directly upon her identity as mother, advocate, and mediatrix of grace. The soul's cry of remorse faded into a fragile silence. The room felt suspended, as though all of heaven leaned in to listen. Faustina realized that the decisive moment had not yet come, but it was drawing near, closer than breath, closer than the dim light flickering beside the bed. What the soul would say next would change everything. Faustina stood in that fragile silence, feeling every spiritual vibration in the room as though her own soul were intertwined with the dying person's fate. She could sense the nearness of something immense, something on the verge of breaking through. The angels seemed to draw closer, no longer merely observing, but anticipating. Their presence felt like a held breath, a poised movement, a readiness to act the very instant heaven gave the command. Even the air itself seemed to tremble, not with fear, but with the weight of a mystery that was about to unfold. For Faustina, this was no ordinary vision. Her senses were sharpened with a supernatural clarity that God sometimes granted her in moments of deep revelation. She could feel the soul's agony as if it were her own. She tasted its despair and its longing. She perceived its memories, its regrets, its trembling hope. But above everything else, she felt the pull of grace, gathering around the soul like an unseen tide rising. Something divine was drawing nearer, gathering momentum, waiting for one final opening. She glanced toward the Blessed Virgin. Mary stood in perfect stillness, not with passivity, but with a poised attentiveness, like a mother leaning over the bed of a child she longs to comfort, but cannot touch until the child calls her name. Faustina saw in Mary's eyes an infinite tenderness mingled with a sacred expectation. Mary was listening, not to the room, not to the angels, but to the depths of the soul itself. Her expression revealed the truth. She was waiting for something very specific, something she knew the soul was capable of saying, something that would unlock the fullness of her maternal power. Faustina felt waves of emotion roll through her. Love, reverence, awe, and something else she rarely experienced, suspense. She genuinely did not know what would be said or how this moment would resolve. What she did know was that the spiritual atmosphere was tightening, focusing, as though the entire universe had narrowed down to one trembling soul and one imminent word. She sensed the great cosmic balance between divine justice and divine mercy, a balance Mary herself was ready to tip with the slightest invitation. The soul stirred again, faintly. Faustina felt the movement not with her eyes, but with her spirit. A small shift, a rising intention, a fragile desire reaching upward like a new flame trying to catch. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the decisive moment was coming. Something deep within the soul was awakening, something it had not yet spoken, something powerful enough to call the Queen of Heaven into immediate action. Faustina leaned forward, her breath caught in her chest. The next words spoken would be unlike the sorrowful confession before. These next words would carry divine resonance. These next words would tear open the veil between earth and heaven. These next words would be the ones Mary came for. The soul drew a trembling breath, not with its lungs, for they were already failing, but with its spirit. Faustina felt the shift instantly. This was not the groan of remorse, nor the whisper of fear. This was something deeper, something rising from a place in the soul that had been dormant for years, perhaps for a lifetime. The air tightened as if heaven itself bent low to listen. Mary's eyes, gentle yet piercing, fixed upon the soul with an intensity that made Faustina's heart shiver. It was as though every angel in the room leaned forward at once. Then the soul spoke, not loudly, not clearly, but with a sincerity that broke through every layer of its past. "Mother, lead me to your son." The words were fragile, almost lost in the fading breath of the dying person. Yet spiritually, they thundered through the room. Faustina felt them reverberate through her entire being. These were the words. She knew it instantly. They were not rehearsed, not formulaic, not part of any memorized prayer. They were the cry of a child who finally recognized the one person who never ceased loving it. A child who understood, even at the final heartbeat, that the road to Christ passes most safely through the heart of his mother. Mary moved. It was not a step. It was not a gesture. It was something far more profound, a radiant surge of maternal authority that filled the room with a light so warm, so penetrating, that Faustina instinctively bowed her head. The Blessed Virgin's expression transformed from waiting to acting, from listening to claiming. She reached toward the trembling soul, and in her eyes shone a tenderness that could melt the hardest despair. For Mary, those 7 simple words were everything. They were trust. They were surrender. They were humility. They were a recognition of her God-given role. They echoed the very words Jesus spoke on the cross when he entrusted humanity to her care. And because they touched the core of her mission to bring souls to her Son, she responded with a swiftness that defied time. Faustina saw the soul illuminated, wrapped in Mary's mantle, lifted with a gentleness no human mother could ever imitate. The room seemed to dissolve into a brightness that overshadowed death itself. There was no judgmental thunder, no terrifying revelation, only a mother fulfilling her divine mandate. The words had been spoken. The response was immediate. Heaven had moved. Faustina stood in awe as she watched the scene unfold, and she understood with piercing clarity why those words, simple, unpolished, barely audible, had moved the Blessed Virgin with such overwhelming immediacy. It was not the eloquence of the plea that mattered, nor the intensity with which it was spoken. It was the truth contained within it, the alignment of the soul's cry with the deepest mission entrusted to Mary by God himself. "Mother, lead me to your son." In that moment, the soul did not ask for escape, nor for ease, nor for a miracle detached from God's will. It asked for the one thing Mary was created, fashioned, and chosen to give. To understand the power of these words, Faustina sensed, one must understand the mystery of Mary's identity. At the foot of the cross, as Christ's precious blood soaked the earth, he did not simply offer his mother as a symbolic gesture of love. He entrusted her with the care of every soul purchased by his sacrifice. She became the gate of heaven, not by poetic title, but by divine decree. When a soul calls upon her with trust, even the faintest trust, she responds because she is acting not only as mother, but as a steward of the graces Christ won. In this light, the soul's request was not merely a plea, it was an act of profound theological truth. It recognized that Mary does not stand between God and humanity as a barrier, but as the shortest, safest path to Jesus. It was a cry that cut through fear, despair, and self-accusation, and touched directly upon the purpose for which heaven delights to send her. A soul saying, "Lead me to your Son," is a soul that has surrendered, that has cast aside pride, that has chosen relationship over fear, trust over paralysis, hope over despair. And heaven always, always rushes towards such a soul. Faustina felt angels move at Mary's side, not as radiant onlookers, but as servants fulfilling their queen's command. The moment those words were spoken, the entire hierarchy of heaven aligned itself with Mary's maternal mission. The demons had no ground left to stand on. Their accusations crumbled, their claims evaporated. For once a soul entrusts its destiny to Mary's guidance, the enemy loses its hold, not because the soul becomes perfect, but because it becomes protected. Mary's response was instant because the soul's request was perfect in its essence. It touched the very heart of divine mercy. It honored the role given to her by Christ, and it activated a promise heaven never breaks, that the Blessed Virgin will not refuse any soul who seeks her help in returning to Jesus. Faustina trembled as the realization pierced her. These were not extraordinary words reserved for saints. These were words any soul, no matter how broken, no matter how lost, could speak. Words powerful enough to move heaven in an instant. The room faded from Faustina's sight, but the meaning of what she witnessed remained carved into her soul with the clarity of revelation. She understood now that what she had seen was not just the rescue of a dying person, nor simply another moment of divine intervention. It was a message for the world, for every soul who would one day face its own final hour, for every heart weighed down by sin, fear, or the feeling of being too far from God to turn back. The words the dying soul had whispered were not mystical in their structure. They were mystical in their surrender. "Mother, lead me to your Son." This was the key that unlocked heaven, the humble cry that aligned a wounded soul with the very love that had created it. Faustina realized that God had shown her this moment not to satisfy her curiosity, but to testify to a truth the world desperately needs. No soul is beyond the reach of mercy when it entrusts itself to Mary's guidance. Mary does not replace Christ. She brings us to him. She does not diminish his mercy. She magnifies it. And for the soul who calls upon her with trust, she does not hesitate. She moves swiftly, maternally, decisively. In her diary, Faustina often wrote of souls who waited too long, of people who delayed repentance, of hearts that hardened because they believed the lie that God would not receive them. But this moment revealed something different, something far more hopeful. A soul that turns to Mary even at the final breath touches the deepest tenderness of heaven, and heaven always responds. The lesson was clear. This was not just a story for the dying, it was guidance for the living. Every believer, no matter how flawed, could approach Mary with the same childlike trust. Every person could whisper those same words in moments of confusion, temptation, grief, or spiritual darkness. And Mary would come, not someday, not eventually, but immediately. Because leading souls to Jesus is not merely her devotion, it is her divine mission. For those who fear death, these words offer peace. For those burdened by sin, they offer a path. For those who feel lost, they offer direction. And for all who love Christ, they offer the most direct route to his heart. The open loop now closes. The words that made the Blessed Virgin instantly take a soul to heaven were not complicated. They were not grand. They were the simple cry of a child returning home. Mother, lead me to your Son. It is a prayer we can carry into our final breath and every breath before it.